Introducing Punchbowl News. From Anna Palmer, Jake Sherman, and John Bresnahan. News about the people who matter, for the people who matter. Join the community at punchbowl.news.
I'm Anna Palmer, CEO and a founder of Punchbowl News. Thank you so much for joining us for our last editorial conversation of the year. We are thrilled to have Senator Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine, join us for this pop-up conversation focused on infrastructure and broadband. Broderick Johnson, Comcast Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Executive Vice President of Digital Equity, will join me afterward for a fireside chat. And a big thank you to Comcast for making this conversation possible. As always, you can find Punchbowl News on social media at Punchbowl News on all platforms. I am A. Palmer DC. We'd love for you to share the conversation on Twitter, Instagram, and wherever you are on social. And now, I'd like to bring Senator Susan Collins to the virtual stage. Senator Collins, thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm delighted to join you, Anna.
We are going to talk a lot about the effort and your role on broadband. But before we get to that, we always do a couple of news of the day questions to start off the conversation. Of course, all eyes are on the Senate and whether Democrats will finish the Build Back Better Act before Christmas, as Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is promising. I wanted to see if you had gotten any insights you could share from your close friend, Senator Joe Manchin, on where things might be standing.
Well, I don't presume to speak for Joe, but I do know from conversations I've had with him as recently as last night that he remains concerned, as many of us are, about the cost of the package and its impact on inflation, which is now at a 40-year high. So I think that the bill is still being shaped to try to respond to those concerns. I also really wonder how the bill can be done in time for Christmas when we don't even have final text yet. The Finance Committee, for example, put out a more than 1,000-page tweak of the House bill, and it has blanks in it in some cases. So there are lots of disputes going on among progressives with more moderates about the SALT provisions. That's the tax deduction for state and local taxes. There are a lot of unresolved issues. And finally, we have the new CBO estimate that says that if you take the gimmicks out of the bill, which assume that certain programs expire after 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, which is highly unlikely, that the real cost of the bill is some $4.7 trillion, $3 trillion of which would it be added to the debt.
Well, I wanted to ask you, one of the key provisions that is getting a lot of attention right now is that child tax credit and the fact that it expires at the end of the year. I know that you have been supportive of different provisions around that. Is there a version of the legislation you could support if Democrats don't get the BBB passed and they have to do some kind of an extension to keep that program going?
You know, in 2017, I worked with Marco Rubio and with the White House and many of our other colleagues, Tim Scott, for example, to increase the child tax credit and to make it refundable for the first time. So that, for example, a single mom with one child who was earning $35,000 a year, instead of paying taxes to the federal government, would actually get assistance from the federal government. So it was linked to working, and the current emergency child tax credit, which was enacted to help out during the pandemic, was not linked to work. And it was made more fully refundable and the amount was increased. This is a perfect example of an issue that should be referred to the Finance Committee have them work on it, see if there's a compromise that we could come up with. But I am wary of severing the link between the credit and work. That's always been like the earned income tax credit. It's always had that link. You give assistance from the government, but you also try to encourage people to work.
I want to ask one last question before we get to broadband, just because it is very newsy today. The debt limit is going to be passed in times to raise the debt limit by the date that Secretary Janet Yellen had indicated. Obviously, that was done by 51 votes, or is going to be done by 51 votes in the Senate. Some of your Republican colleagues have been pretty critical of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell for allowing this one time for the debt limit to be raised without that 60 vote threshold. I just wanted to get your sense of how concerned you are, and if you might support any longer term reforms around the debt limit, as some have suggested maybe there needs to be a wholesale relooking at this issue.
Well, first of all, let me say that we can never allow our country to default on its debts. We never have, and we never should. On the other hand, what I don't like, and I'm glad that Senator McConnell worked out this agreement, is this debt limit isn't just covering spending that has already occurred. It's making room for the Build Back Better Act. And that's why it's increasing the debt limit. After we just did it recently, it's going to be increased by $2.5 trillion, is I believe the amount that has been settled on. And that allows for a pretty substantial increase in spending. And I'm really worried that that'll increase inflation still more. Now, there has been discussion of whether or not we should even have a debt limit. Some countries don't have a debt limit. My problem with that is if we do away with the debt limit, we will never take a look at how much we're spending. And that concerns me. It has been the pressure of the debt limit and the need to increase it that in the past has prompted commissions to take a look at our spending process, budget reforms that have been useful. And I think if we didn't have that pressure, all Washington would do is spend and spend and spend, because there would be less awareness of the debt. Now, you may say we spend and spend and spend anyway, but at least it has led to some changes in the past. I mean, sometimes I've not been crazy about the changes, such as sequestration, which wasn't across the board, except for certain entitlement programs like Social Security. Cut if you don't meet the budget targets. I think we should be more selective than that. But we really need to reform the budget process. And I, for one, do not think that getting rid of the debt limit is a good idea.
All right, let's talk broadband. You were a key negotiator along with 9 other senators that allowed for this historic Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to be signed into law by the president in November. You worked very closely with Senator Jeanne Sheehan, the Democrat from New Hampshire, as part of the broadband working group. Can you talk about that relationship and why this is different than so much in Congress where Republicans and Democrats can't even be in the same room together?
Well, Jean and I work extremely well together. We share a lot of the same goals, whether it's healthcare or the plight of Afghan women or the need to expand broadband to rural areas. Now, we're both representing northern New England states, so we have a lot of issues in common. For example, we both work to support a shipyard that is in Maine, as I remind Jean, but employs, it's right on the border, and half of the workers are from New Hampshire and half are from Maine. And so we have a lot in common on issues that affect our state. In addition, neither of us is a bomb thrower. We tend to work in a collaborative way. We're pragmatic. We want solutions. And I was delighted when within our group of 10, Jean and I were able to take the lead on expanding broadband to underserved and unserved areas, because that's so important in our states. And the pandemic really laid bare the disparities that occurred because of a lack of access to high-speed internet services.
Can you talk a little bit, just kind of zoom in a little bit on what this impact will have for your home state of Maine? As you said, rural, underserved areas. Not all the deployment has happened, obviously, but what impact do you think it will have?
Well, let me give you a couple of real-life examples. First, let me say that we have about 79,000 unserved Maine households. We then have more than, it's close to 400,000 that are underserved. So they have access, but the broadband is too slow to support, for example, telemedicine conferences. So we believe in Maine that this is going to make a huge difference. During the pandemic, I received a call from a selectman who lives on an island off Maine called Swan's Island. And he was talking about the hardship for older people living on the island who had medical appointments and had to take the ferry to get to the mainland, then drive. And it was very difficult. Plus, they were worried about being exposed to COVID. This was before the vaccines came out. And he said, other parts of the state are able to use telemedicine, and the healthcare professional is able to interview the patient and has a long-standing relationship with the patient and can check vital signs, can keep up with how they're doing with their medications, see whether changes are needed. And he said, we can't do that. Another example in northern Maine, where I'm originally from, a family told me that it would cost $15,000 for fiber to connect them to the internet. And they simply could not afford that. Their children were on a hybrid education system, sometimes in the classroom, sometimes via the computer, and they had to go to the local library in order to have access to a hotspot that they needed in order to connect with their classroom. So we saw it was difficult for people to work from home. Another employer told me that he wasn't going to locate in an area of Maine that really needs good jobs because of the lack of high-speed internet. It's become not a luxury, but a necessity. So in a rural state that's a large rural state like Maine, having access to high-speed internet and making it future-proof by so that we don't have to redo things in just a few years makes a real difference in terms of the economy, healthcare, and education. And that's why I'm so excited about the $65 billion that we negotiated, Gina and I negotiated with the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, who was terrific. And I'll tell you, we were in my office at times till midnight working on this. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of difficult issues, such as affordability, rate regulation, that we had to resolve.
I want to ask, so much of the conversation around tech in Washington is toxic, it's heated, whether it's net neutrality or right now, obviously very big, the fight over regulating big tech. But it seemed like, you just mentioned two Democrats, Secretary Gina Raimondo, your work with Senator Sheen. It feels like broadband infrastructure doesn't fall into that same bucket, if you will.
I would agree with that. There is widespread bipartisan support on broadband deployment. And there are different views on whether just the private sector should be involved or whether it should be public-private, whether municipalities should be able to be the service provider or at least set up the infrastructure and then turn it over to a service provider. Those are all issues. At one point, the administration was interested in rate regulation at the federal level, which I was very opposed to and did not make it into the final bill, I'm pleased to say. But we did agree that there needed, if the private sector was going to get the benefit of this deployment money, that they should be required to provide a low-cost, affordable plan to lower-income families so that they could afford the service once we got the infrastructure in place. So there were certainly issues, but you're absolutely right that this tends to be an area like roads and bridges where there is bipartisan support. And I think it's because in this day and age, we realize that the internet is as important as roads and bridges in connecting us and allowing us to do our jobs, to access healthcare, and to gain more education.
We are quickly running out of time, but I do want to look forward a little bit. Now that the bill has passed, President Joe Biden has tasked Mitch Landrieu to head the interagency task force for implementation and to prevent waste. What are you watching in regards to this? Or have you been speaking to Mitch Landrieu? Are there any areas of concern that are already starting to pop up?
Well, Mitch and I are going to be talking later today, as luck would have it. And I'm going to suggest that he regularly brief the 10 of us who drafted the bipartisan infrastructure bill so that we can keep tabs on how it's going, not just the broadband section, but the entire bill. I'm glad that the president has appointed a coordinator since there are a lot of different agencies and departments that are involved in the implementation of this historic bill. And I look forward to working with Mitch. I served with his sister, Mary Landrieu, so I feel like I know him. And I was also very involved in when Hurricane Katrina struck. I was chair of the Homeland Security Committee at that time. And I think that he has a lot of experience in this area and is a good choice.
Before I let you go, you mentioned the Gang of 10. Obviously, you worked extremely closely together on this issue. Do you have any expectation, or are you optimistic that the 10 of you could get together again in 2022 on any issues and work together on another piece of legislation?
I am. Just this morning, I joined in a conference call with the group No Labels, and they have helped to bring together centrists from both the House and the Senate. And we talked about our accomplishments with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but also last December, the last bipartisan COVID bill, the $900 billion bill that we put together. And we look to the future. There's so much that I think cries out for a bipartisan approach. I wish that the president would separate off parts of the Build Back Better bill, because I think that if it went through our group or the normal committee process or both, that there are issues there, such as on child care, where we could reach an agreement that would involve increasing access and affordability to childcare. That would be one example. Another really tough issue, but that we're going to have to tackle sooner or later, is immigration reform. And to me, you could put together a border security section with a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, those young people who are brought to this country by their parents at a very young age. And so I think there's opportunity for working together on immigration. We have a real shortage of workers and need more for the tourism and agricultural and health professions industries, for example. And that's an area where I think we could work together too. I know immigration is very controversial and maybe it would be extremely hard to do in an election year. Maybe people will be hesitant, but I, for one, am ready to roll up my sleeves.
All right. Senator Collins, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anna. Great to talk with you.
All right, now I'd like to welcome Broderick Johnson, Executive Vice President of Public Policy and Executive Vice President of Digital Equity, to the stage. Broderick, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Anna, thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Well, I look forward to building on the conversation that Senator Collins and I were just having. We are going to talk all things broadband infrastructure this afternoon, but I was hoping you could kind of set this stage for us. The pandemic really put into focus, I think, even as the senator said, some of the challenges and opportunities for infrastructure, for broadband in particular, with people working from home, schooling from home. What did you see in your role in terms of what you think went well and maybe where there are some challenges that remain?
Sure. And again, thank you, Anna. And let me begin by thanking Senator Collins. And it's a real honor to share this virtual stage with her. Let me thank her for her exceptional leadership in helping to secure what by far is the federal government's largest investment ever in broadband and towards closing the digital divide. As was mentioned, Senator Collins was a key negotiator along with 9 other senators, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats in total, on a really historic Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed by President Biden in November. And she did that in a bipartisan way, ultimately funding $65 billion for broadband. That's great news for the people of her state and across the nation. To your question, Anna, so the internet worked exceptionally well these last 2 years. And that wasn't an accident. In fact, it was a result of billions of dollars that have annually been invested by internet service providers in broadband networks under a very wise approach to build out the broadband ecosystem. And during these 2 years, those investments have helped so many stay connected to school and to their healthcare providers, issues that Senator Collins certainly highlighted with some important anecdotes about people in her own state. In fact, according to a McKinsey study, by July 2021, telehealth, which again was emphasized by Senator Collins, telehealth utilization was nearly 40 times higher than it had been before the pandemic. So as difficult as the past 2 years have been for all of us, the benefits and impact of broadband have been indispensable.
You talk about kind of the, years-long effort that companies and the different kind of private sector investment has been making. But, I think as the senator highlighted and you just highlighted, this is a historic amount of money that is going to be available for broadband purposes. Can you talk about how that funding changes the landscape going forward?
Yeah, let me start with this. For so many of us, the internet has worked really well. We also know that's not the case for everyone, not even close. We know that there are 2 core parts of the digital divide. As the senator mentioned, there are unserved locations, and there are millions of our fellow citizens who haven't adopted broadband. Now, on the good news side, adoption rates, and adoption is extremely critical to focus on, but adoption rates for low-income households, underrepresented minorities, rural households, and individuals with lower levels of education attainment have been increasing steadily over the last decade. And yet, despite these gains, broadband adoption not deployment, but adoption, remains the most significant barrier to achieving digital equity. While only approximately 2%, again, 2% of Americans lack access to fixed broadband, over 20% do not subscribe to fixed broadband at home. Now, for the last decade, I'm proud to say Comcast has been committed to doing our part to close the broadband adoption gap through our Internet Essentials program, where we've connected more than 10 million people to high-speed internet at home. And I'm also proud to announce, in fact, today that Comcast has installed free Wi-Fi in its 1,000th lift zone in St. Paul, Minnesota. These lift zones are community centers where folks can get access to the internet. We have also set a new goal to install 250 additional lift zones before the end of 2022. Lift zones are part of Project Up, which is our comprehensive, looking forward 10-year commitment of $1 billion to help build a future of unlimited possibilities.
So talk to me a little bit. You also had your own article that you wrote this afternoon, an opinion article. What was the goal? What was the message that you were sharing? I believe it was in Baltimore.
Yeah, so that's my hometown. I was born in Baltimore, and I'm very proud of Baltimore, my home city. It's a city that faces a lot of challenges, but a city of great people and always of great potential. The digital divide, and I've been following the digital divide for decades now, going back to when I worked for President Clinton, and we had a number of White House programs and events focused on a digital divide. And back then, the conversations were oftentimes about connectivity and the fact that so many parts of the country were not connected. And over the course of these decades, though, the challenge of the digital divide has evolved a bit into affordability, and also now largely about adoption. And so today, I wanted in my piece to talk about the adoption challenges in Baltimore. Something like 99% of folks in Baltimore have access to wired broadband, but in 2 of every 5 households in Baltimore City, people have not taken advantage of that. So I wanted to highlight what it means in my hometown and how important it is because of the difference it can make in people's lives in terms of education, job skills, telehealth, and the like. So it was a very hometown-oriented message, and I'm very proud to have been able to use my voice in Baltimore.
We are quickly running out of time for this conversation, but I want to ask, as I ended with the senator, on implementation. The president has put Mitch Landrieu in charge of making sure that this money is being deployed in good ways, that there's not waste involved in it. Can you talk about that implementation phase, actually getting money to these communities and the people it's intended to help?
Yeah, that's extraordinarily important, and I'm very glad that the president has appointed Mitch Landrieu. Had a chance to work with him when he was mayor of New Orleans, and I know he was a fantastic mayor and a great partner on many things that I worked on and that were priorities for President Obama. There's so much money involved here, historic numbers, as we've said. And it is therefore so important that there be transparency, that there be evaluations of how the money is being spent and dispersed, the impact that it's having, and to make sure that we are learning. The government is learning, the private sector is learning, and we're being honest about those things that work to make sure that people adopt broadband and they use it effectively to improve their lives and to create unlimited possibilities. And so as this money is rolled out, it's just going to be extremely important that we be clear about how it's being spent. And I have tremendous faith that leaders like Senator Collins and Senator Shaheen and the bipartisan group of senators who worked with those 2 senators, along with members of the House of Representatives and the White House, I have great faith they want to ensure that this massive amount of federal investment in broadband is spent wisely and effectively. We have never seen this kind of an investment in broadband before, that's for sure. And we need to make sure, though, that the taxpayers' money is effectively spent.
All right, we're going to end it there. Broderick, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. A special thanks to Senator Collins for joining us as well, and to all of you for joining us on this virtual stream, hearing about broadband and some of the issues of the day. A big thank you to Comcast for making this conversation possible. This is it for 2021 and Punchbowl News live editorial events, but we will be back with bigger and better plans in 2022, so stay tuned for those. Thank you so much. Have a great day and stay safe.